land of the Métis. Just before we begin, I'd just like you all to be aware that this event is being live streamed. The web camera is up to your right here. We will not be filming the audience. However, it will pick up your phone if it rings during the event. So now is a great time to double check that you silenced or turned that off. I'd also like to say a few brief words of introduction for our host this evening, Bill Waiser. Bill is a historian, an author, and two-time Governor General's Award winner. His latest book, which was co-written with Jennie Hansen, is Cheated, the Laurier Liberals and the Theft of First Nations Reserve Land. Bill lives here in Saskatoon, and he has generously agreed to join us tonight and be your host for the evening. So everyone, please give him a warm welcome.
Thank you. I guess I don't have to introduce myself now. But it's my great pleasure to welcome you to the Saskatoon launch. We came second, by the way. He was in PA last night. Okay. It's like Laurier in 1905. Wilfrid Laurier had the choice of going to Alberta or Saskatchewan first. Guess where he went first? Right. Edmonton. Yeah. So we're the second choice, but it's great to have you here, Jerry. We'll forgive you, maybe. We want to welcome you to the reader welcome. Saskatoon launch of Gerald Friesen's The Honourable John Norquay, Indigenous Premier, Canadian Statesman. I'd like to thank McNally Robinson Books for hosting tonight's event, and note that the publisher is the University of Manitoba Press. I'm here to stick handle things. I'll introduce Jerry, invite him to talk about the book. I don't think you're interested in doing a reading tonight. I don't think this crowd is young enough to be read to. We'll take some time for questions. I'll start and then turn it over to the audience. And at the end, Jerry will gladly sign all the books you buy. Hint, hint, nudge, nudge, right? Now, Jerry is one of Canada's premier historians. He's born in Prince Albert. He did his undergraduate work in history at the University of Saskatchewan in the early 1960s. He did his graduate work in Toronto and joined the faculty at the University of Manitoba in 1970. Today, he is Distinguished Professor Emeritus. Jerry is perhaps best known before this book for his work, The Canadian Prairies, A History. For years, it was the standard text for Western Canadian history courses. Jerry's been recognized many times, many ways. Here's just a few. He's a member of the Order of Canada. He's a former president of the Canadian Historical Association. He's a fellow of the Royal Society of Canada and a recipient of the Society's Tyrrell Medal for outstanding work in Canadian history. Jerry is also, here it comes, in the Prince Albert Sports Hall of Fame as a member of the 1954 PA Cosmos Little League provincial champions. Jerry and I have a special symmetry. His father's family settled in Saskatchewan, but he does Manitoba history. My father's family settled in Manitoba, and yet I do Saskatchewan history. Symmetry. On a personal note, I'd like to say that Jerry is one of the nicest people you'll ever meet, and I mean that sincerely. He's a true friend, he's generous with his time, and he's a tireless advocate for history. He's also here tonight with his partner, another historian, Gerald Friesen. Please welcome Gerald Friesen and his book, The Honourable John Norquay, Indigenous Premier, Canadian Statesman.
Well, first of all, thank you, Bill. That's is this working?
I think.
How's that?
Yeah.
Better. That's better. Okay. That's an extraordinary introduction. So I thank you, Bill, very much. I'm here to talk about a book and about a man and about the prairies in Saskatchewan and Prince Albert and Red Deer Hill and Batoff and those sorts of things. Obviously, I grew up with all this stuff, and so I suspected many of you. One of the things that bothers me most about Canada today is that people don't know any of the stories that shape them and have shaped them. We don't know much about ourselves. And so when Bill says I'm an apostle of history, I'm not sure that's quite the way I'd put it, but I certainly believe there are many things in our story that none of us know much about, and we should know. And one of them is John Norquay. So he's one of the most important figures in Canada in the 1880s, as important as John A. Macdonald, for example. And yet, it's a name that rings no bells anywhere, I suspect, in the entire country. It happens that 40 years ago, 38 to be precise, the letters that had been sent to him and 1,000 of the letters he wrote ended up in the provincial archives in Manitoba, basically 100 years after they had been pulled from the files of the government of Manitoba. They were in a trunk. The family had held them for 60 years, gave them to a woman who wanted to do a book on Norquay. She worked for 40 years on it, went to Medicine Hat, where Norquay owned a coal mine, went to Vancouver, where Norquay's son, a very articulate man, told her about his family, went to England, Scotland, the Orkney Islands, where Norquay's grandfather was from, and did all this work and kept notes. But in the end, 40 years on of holding all these letters, 4,000 letters to him, 1,000 letters by him, she just couldn't pull it together. She had a couple of small strokes, and that's when she gave these letters to the archives. But she stipulated a number of things about them. Most important, they had to be copied. They had to be indexed precisely. Nobody would be allowed to see them until all this work had been done. And the consequence was that nobody in the archives anymore does that kind of work. And so they recruited an older woman, historian, to do that work as a volunteer. And so over a decade or so, that wonderful woman created this spectacular index, organized all these papers, and I happened to retire at about the time they were open. And I couldn't decide whether it was the pool hall, the beer parlor, or the archives that I should spend my time in. And of course, I chose the beer parlor. That's a Saskatchewan, Prince Albert sort of thing. I started going to the archives 5 days a week, and 4 or 5 hours at a time, I worked on these letters. And they were sufficiently interesting that I decided about 1.5 years in that the story to tell was the Norquay story itself. So that's what I've done. It's a long book, but my friends tell me there's 2 ways to do it. You read 20 pages a day, and it takes you 3 weeks. Or you read a chapter a day, and it takes you 2 weeks. But either way, I think you'll find the stories are interesting. Now, I'm just going to tell you a couple. Norquay was elected to the legislature of Manitoba in the first election in 1870. By that point, he was the best educated local boy in Manitoba. He had been in schools, parish school, with 40 or 50 kids in his school. And there were about 15 parish schools at that time, 7 of them Catholic, 8 of them Protestant. Of those Protestants, the bishop said, we're going to hold exams to see who's the best of the students, and we're going to give them a scholarship. And Norquay won easily. He was regarded as the brightest kid in the entire group. That bishop had created a special school, much better than the parish schools. It called it, in fact, preparatory for Oxford and Cambridge. So it's like an English prep school. And so Norquay studied Latin, Greek, French, 4 approaches to math, including calculus, and for 4 years. By the age of 17, he was more than a high school grad in today's terms. And so that's his base. He taught school, he hunted buffalo, he farmed, and in 1871, he was elected to the House. He was a cabinet minister within 8 months. He was a cabinet minister for most of the next 7 years. He was the best member of the assembly in that period, the smartest, the quickest, the wittiest. And by 1878, when a short-lived premier resigned, Norquay was clearly the one to succeed him. He then, from 1878 to 1887, 9 full years, won 4 general elections as the premier. So he was supervising, essentially, Manitoba's crucial decade. It has never had a more important decade in its sad history, which is, it's a kind of quiet, poor province, you would think. As I come to Saskatchewan, I look at the money around me, I think, man, Manitoba, it doesn't have the uranium, it doesn't have the oil, it doesn't have the potash. Well, it's got 1 mine now. But we just don't have the money you've got. Thank God for federal equalization payment. We get it from you. So anyway.
But you have good soil.
Very good soil, if you own some. And it is spectacular. This is true. That's another story, but we won't go there. Where do I want to go? I want to tell you that Norquay, in the period as premier, 1878 to the end of 1887, basically was the prairie premier. Because, of course, there was no real territorial political strength in that decade, right through to the end of his premiership. The only prairie political leadership comes from the Manitoba cabinet. And Norquay was a very impressive premier. He devised, created for the first time, the idea that there should be provincial expeditions, diplomatic expeditions to Ottawa to change the terms that John A. Macdonald has laid down for the prairies in 1870. And over the course of the 9 years he was premier, he did revise in every important way but one, the deal that Macdonald had imposed on the prairies in 1870. So he altered the direction of the CPR. Bill's going to have to argue with me about that in a minute. He expanded the province's boundaries by quadruple, so that in 1881, Manitoba was larger than Ontario. Now, it lost a court case in London, if you can imagine, 3 years later, and Ontario got the gigantic empire that should never have been its empire. So, but nothing we could do about that. It's just what happened in a court in London. He won a huge increase in the size of the federal grant to Manitoba. And why would he do that? Because nowhere in the prairies was land controlled by local people. It was all controlled directly from Ottawa and owned by Ottawa. And so Norquay, knowing he couldn't change John A. Macdonald's mind on that ownership question, it was only changed in 1930, if you can imagine. Then the prairie governments finally got control of land for the first time. But Norquay got larger grants in lieu of ownership, and that was extremely important. So Norquay was a premier for the prairies. In 1887, however, we got into another problem that Bill and I will probably talk about in a few minutes. What else? First of all, I emphasize here, of all the things about him, he was Indigenous. He was more First Nation in family background than Louis Riel. He was an extraordinary representative of English-speaking, what we would say today, Métis. He spoke, as I said, French and English well. He spoke Bungi, the dialect that people in Red River and the fur trade developed out of Gaelic, Norn, which is do you know Norn? You were just okay. It's an Orkney and Norse dialect, and so if you can imagine a language that pulls words from Cree, Soto, Anishinaabe, as it is called today, English, French, and puts it in a new sing-song kind of way. That's Bungi. And Norquay spoke Bungi, as did most people in Red River in the 1840s, 50s, 60s. French, the Chief, you know, Métis, French Métis have a distinct language that is much closer to the indigenous languages than Bungi was. And Norquay also spoke Chief. So he was a 5 or 6 language man in the fur trade and worked in French Michif communities for several years. So I'm saying he's Indigenous. The other thing I guess I would insist on, if anybody ever asked me,
I know, but
he's, how would I put this? He's so strong as a representative of Prairie Canada forever. You know, he should be regarded as one of the greatest statesmen, I call it that in the title of the book, Prairie Canada has ever produced. He had a genuine insight into how politics works, and he managed to change the country. Now, one other touch I'll just touch on here. He also was subject to racism. There's no question that the Orange Lodge Ontarians in the Conservative Party in Manitoba, and Norquay was the founder of the Manitoba Conservative Party, but his Orange Lodge allies in Manitoba didn't really want him as their premier. But the farmers out in the districts around in Manitoba liked him. And so the consequence was that Norquay represented rural Manitoba, whereas in the city of Winnipeg, by this time a big city of 20,000 people, in other words, a huge city in 1887, it was kind of an enemy for Norquay. The Orange Lodge was powerful and it was racist. And so Norquay simply had to survive that and did. And in the end, John A. And Bill and I will talk about this in a minute, double-crossed Norquay and literally intervened in provincial politics to throw him out of office. So that was the political end of Norquay. Not that he disappeared, he was in the legislature for the next 18 months. And then, as we'll touch upon this later, I'll tell you about the end of all this. So you can see what I'm emphasizing. He was a great man. It's too bad he's been forgotten. I think his memory should be revived and his example should be revived. So, but Bill and I will talk about that.
Thank you. Have a seat. Thank you very much, Jerry. So Jerry and I've got some questions for Jerry, and we'll have a bit of a discussion, and then we'll throw it out to your questions. Okay. So I'm going to start with a very general softball question for you, Jerry, to get you relaxed. No, but you've done a big synthesis in the past. You've done the Canadian Prairies, which pulled together a lot of the existing literature into a readable account of prairie history. Now you've done a big biography, a big book. What are the strengths and weaknesses of each approach in telling prairie history?
It's a softball question.
Yes.
Okay. Well, first of all, how you do it is very different. In the Canadian prairies history, 1984, I had to read everything that had recently been published over the preceding 30 to 40 years, and indeed the earlier stuff as well. And then to see what patterns I could make that covered the region. And so, there's the fur trade, there's Manitoba and the resistance of 1869-70, there's the CPR, national policy, and so on. The issues are pretty clear. In fact, I could design the book before I started to write it completely because I knew what the big issues were, and all I had to do was find a way to tell it that was effective. Norquay, I didn't know what I was getting into. And the papers, if you imagine 5,000 letters to Norquay over 15 years, they end up in pigeonholes on a desk that had, I think, 100 pigeonholes. And so the archivist or the government secretary who pulled them out just pulled them out and put them in red pink ribbons and stuck them in a trunk. The woman who organized the papers didn't change that organization. So the first problem I had was trying to figure out who Norquay was. And that I only felt comfortable about that I had actually answered that question by the end of my writing. And I concluded, by the way, he was a very good man, a very good family man. His children wrote him lovely letters. I quote a number of them, and they sound like fun, the kids do. He became a drinker, but he'd been temperance before that, but he never drank a lot. He was very cautious that way. He became a poker player because everybody played poker who was in politics. He described in 1885 how he'd like to come out here and fight Riel, but he was busy finishing the session. And the guy, one of his friends, was out here toward Batoche and wanted the poker chips from the assembly. And Norquay said they were too busy in use, and he couldn't loan them until the session was over. He was a fascinating guy, and I should just tell you this: he was 6'1" at a time when somebody who's tall was 5'6".
Yeah. But along those lines, sir, do you think that, we did the Canadian prairies, you're dealing with big themes. Do you think with a biography, you're able to take those big themes, but put a human face on those stories, those themes, and make it relatable to people? Can you do that through biography, or you can't do that through a synthesis?
Absolutely true. That's a very good point. I felt always that I was touching on the major themes. CPR is one we're going to talk about. But I could do it through Norquay's own problems, his own ways of addressing a policy question. And the racism, for example, there was no, well, anyway, I definitely thought I got all the major questions in the Norquay biography, and I definitely think I found a way to talk about them in his terms.
Great. Okay. The Métis today are often understood as one people, one nation, usually identified as the product of First Nations French liaisons. But Norquay, as they say in the PA district, was an English Métis. Can you tell us something about that identity and the importance of Orkney?
Again, absolutely. The Hudson's Bay Company was staffed almost exclusively by Orkney men. Not Scotsmen so much, although those were the officers, they'd had good educations, but by Orkney laborers, 5 foot tall, accustomed to a hard life and very hard workers. And so hundreds of them, over the course of a century, as you know, came to Prairie Canada, intermarried with Indigenous people, and then their children would continue to intermarry, as was the case in Norquay's family. And they spoke this separate dialect, Bungi, which became the kind of dialect that Indigenous people in northern Saskatchewan and Manitoba learned. So it's a special kind of rhythm, a special kind of language, a dialect. And they would be about 30 to 40% of all the Métis in Western Canada in that period. So not a small number. In Manitoba itself, when the census was taken in 1870, 5,600 people were French Michif speaking, 4,400 were English Bungi speaking. So 56 to 44. So you can see English Métis are extremely important. And Prince Albert, as you say, was essentially an English Métis town for those first, 20 or 30 years. And the names are still there. I didn't know this, Bob, you probably didn't know it either. But lots of those names in PA were Orkney names. And they were mixed ancestry people.
Yeah. Not being from PA, but I'm going to say a comment about, I think 1885 changes the whole outlook of PA and how it presents itself and how it sees itself. 1885 is the turning point.
It's a crucial year in Prince Albert's terms. I think it's a crucial year in Prairie terms. And what's most important and saddest, I think it's the most important year in Canada's terms. In other words, I think Queen Victoria is allegedly responsible for 200 small wars between 1837 and her death in 1901. 200 Queen Victoria's little wars. Now this was one of them, 1885. And it was treated that way in Canada. From the Maritimes through to BC, this was a great rallying moment for the British Empire. And the thing that hurts the most, I think, for Norquay is that it simply embedded racism, anti-Indigenous racism in the Canadian society. And it remained that way and had done for 100 years. And so 1885, I fully agree with you.
Yeah, they could no longer be trusted.
Exactly.
That's the attitude. We're going to talk about two Red River people, and that's Louis Riel and John Norquay, but they differ quite a bit in their outlook. Can you talk about that? Can you talk about how they differed in their ambitions? And can you talk about how they differed in their vision for Western Canada?
I think this is one of the crucial questions in the book. I think I have a handle on both, but it took a while. Riel, 1844, so 3 years younger than Norquay. Catholic education, French education, age of 14, sent to Montreal, 10 years in Montreal, age 14 to 24. Comes back to Red River, and within months is involved in the resistance and is the president of that resistance. A very difficult thing for a 25-year-old young man to be doing. One who hardly knows everyone in Red River because he's left when he's 14. 5 years of intense political battles, most of them spent in New England because Canada was going to hang him if they could find him. Those Orange Lodges would. And then he essentially falls into what would we call it, a breakdown. And his friends put him in a hospital for 2 years. And eventually, another few months later, he comes west, speaks to the people in Manitoba. He's not going to stay there, goes to Montana, marries, has a couple of kids. And it's from there that he's invited back to Saskatchewan in 1885. So this is a very French man, French educated, Quebec educated. And what he comes out of that experience with is an awareness of nation. France in the 19th century is building itself as a nation. 1850s, 60s, 70s are Europe's nation decades. Italy becomes a nation. People discover that they have national meaning. And Riel actually comes out of this thinking the Métis can be a nation. And that's a pivotal insight that he has. Métis is nation. Norquay, born 1841, Anglican school, as I said, he becomes essentially a Protestant, British, property owning, easily adjusting to Canadian terms, and doesn't really think about a collective Métis identity. He talks about his countrymen. They are Métis like him, or they're French, but they're countrymen with him. But they'll have rights as individuals. They'll have rights of the kind given to them by their membership in the larger community. And so Norquay differs very much from Riel and thinks that everybody can get along in the longer term. Now, that idea of Riel's is ignored for 100 years. Norquay's approach is the one that survives. The Métis are never recognized constitutionally, whereas the First Nations are. And then comes 1982. New Constitution. Harry Daniels talks to Pierre Trudeau. And it's not that we have two Indigenous peoples in Canada. We have three. First Nations, what was called in the Constitution Indians, Inuit, and Métis. And so the decision on Constitution in 1982 has reversed 100 years of Canadian political history and changed the Métis position in Canada. And that's the consequence of what we're living with as a consequence over the previous 40 years, over the period from 1982 to the present. And so the rise of Métis Nation, of Saskatchewan, of Alberta, of British Columbia, of Ontario, the Manitoba Métis Federation, what they say, if you go to the Winnipeg airport, a giant banner, homeland of the Métis Nation. This is a new context for Canada and one that we're going to have to deal with over the next generation.
Okay, picking up on that, then, do you think because of Norquay's view of Canada, the Métis, English Métis place in the West, etc., is that why he didn't support the resistance in 1885? Is that why the English Métis stayed on the sidelines in 1885?
Yes, definitely. Plus, I think the idea, Norquay was an optimist, and he believed that he could work with Ottawa. I've just described these negotiations he had. Well, John A. listened to him, and John A. changed the deal for the West. So Norquay was an optimist. He really believed that they could get along. But as I say, he was a British Protestant English language guy. Riel, French language, Catholic, they were already on the outs. The Orange Lodge was taking over Canada, I think, at that time. And, Canada became a much harsher country after 1885.
Uh, 85. Who's their hero?
I have an answer to that. My impression was an amazing Métis intellectual. He had a cabin at Lac La Ronge in the 1950s that had more works related to Karl Marx than anyone else in Saskatchewan. He was a very deeply thoughtful Métis leader. He came to PA in 1960-61, hired by the University of Saskatchewan to do a field survey on the city. And his conclusion was that English Métis had disappeared in Prince Albert. They just wasn't, there weren't people there anymore. Now, I was in grade 11, 12. Wavell was in grade 12 in that time. And that's true. You know, the people we knew, someone named Spence. Anyway, I could go over all the names and you know them all.
Yeah. Well, what's right, about 10 years ago, I was taken on a personal tour of the outlying parishes of Prince Albert by two English Métis men who were proud of their heritage and made it very clear to me during the day with them that they did not support Riel to this day.
That's right.
And very proud of it.
And Norquay was the same.
It was quite interesting, this tour, and even down to today.
Yeah. Two of Norquay's sons fought against Riel in 1885. Norquay himself wrote a very scathing letter about it. All of this is in a chapter, I think it's chapter 12 or so.
Yeah.
It's called An Unfortunate Family Difference. And that's how he looked at 1885.
Yeah. On that tour that day, I was taken to a church where the sons of Peter Fiddler are buried. And I'm trying to remember the name of that parish. But Peter Fiddler, the HBC surveyor, English Métis, his sons had moved to the Prince Albert district. But in this graveyard, you had several sons and their spouses. It might have been in the Lindsay district.
That sounds right.
Yeah, but I've been looking for it ever since. One day I'll find it again. So let's turn to Norquay and Macdonald. You've just described Norquay as a person that could negotiate, or at least think he could negotiate or deal with somebody like John A. Macdonald. Why did they wrangle? What went wrong?
Well, first of all, every year Macdonald heard from these Winnipeg Tories, the Orange Lodge people, that Norquay was a terrible guy. So he knew about it and supported Norquay consciously and consistently through the early 1880s. He regarded Norquay as, quote, loyal, unquote, and said so in an important letter to the Governor General. We trust Norquay, he is loyal. And in 1885, he even said to George Stephen, president of the CPR, we've got to get Norquay reelected. Do send money to the newspapers in Manitoba to support Norquay. So up to then, he was on side. But of course, the CPR was completed in 1885. And then the question was, well, what about the freight rates for shipping Manitoba grain eastward? Because this is when we started to be an export grain economy. And the CPR rates were absolutely appalling. And there was no way a farmer could survive with those rates. And the farmers of Manitoba, rural supporters of Norquay, said, we've got to have competition. But the CPR contract said, CPR has a monopoly. You cannot have a railway to the border. Norquay says to Macdonald, we can't live with this any longer. Macdonald replies, you have to. Norquay says, I'm not going to. He comes back to Manitoba. He creates a corporation to build a railway straight south. It would be the third railway parallel within 20 miles heading south down the Red River, but this one would connect with the American lines. John A. was not going to have it. And the CPR, crazy, didn't care about that, but they wanted more money. They built the darn railway. It now ran from the Atlantic to the, at least from Toronto to the Pacific. But George Stephen, its president, figured that's enough. I'm not going to make any more money out of this one. I'm going to Minneapolis, St. Paul. I'm joining James J. Hill, the big American railway baron. We're going to build the Great Northern Railway from Minneapolis to the Pacific. I'm taking my money and running. I'm fed up with all these arguments in Manitoba. And so he essentially pushed Macdonald into jettisoning my poor Norquay. And John A. went along with it. George Stephen took his money, went to St. Paul, became superbly rich, one of the richest guys in the world, along with Donald A. Smith, Lord Transcona. They both bought oil, sorry?
Strathcona.
Strathcona. And he bought oil in Iraq. Burma Oil became BP. You know, they became big wheels in Britain. And Norquay left in the dust. John A. Macdonald said to his Winnipeg allies, throw him out of office. And they did.
I've got one more question, then we'll throw it out to the audience. So, Jerry, how does your study of Norquay speak to Indigenous, non-Indigenous relations in Canada today?
It's a very good question. I would say he offers another way of thinking about being Indigenous, first of all. It's very interesting to talk to English Métis people, as I have done over the last couple of months, about Norquay, because they hadn't known much about him, but they welcomed this alternative view of being Métis. And so what happens with a story like this is that you see another way to be Métis. And Don Norquay, for example, a friend of mine now, whom I've been interviewing over the last decade about the family, sees his ancestor, John, as an alternative to the kind of crisis that Riel had to live. The Riel story is such a tragedy. The Norquay story is an exceptional one of success. So, you know, I think what it does is offer another perspective on what it is to be Indigenous in Canada. It also sharpens our view of racism among the rest of us, the whites of Canada, the Orange Lodge of Canada, and also the Francophones. You know, one of the things that surprised me was how similar to the Orange Lodge were those Quebecers who came out as Francophone Catholics and couldn't get along with the French Métis. And so the division between the Orange Lodge and English Métis was matched by the division between Quebec Francophones and the Michif French, or Michif French Métis. So I guess the Norquay story is to me is one of success, Indigenous success in Canada. Thank you.
I'm going to throw it up for questions, and I'll take the microphone out. Am I well trained?
I was going to offer, but you've got it.
Don't be shy. We don't want this to be a seminar where everybody looks down.
Hi, Jerry.
Hi, Bob.
The fact that so few of us know anything about this man leaves the inquiring mind into, like, why is that? And one of the possibilities is maybe there was some active process of concealment, or maybe it was just everybody forgot. Why do you think we know so little about this man?
Lovely question. I guess I would start by saying, how many provincial premiers of the 19th century can you name? And the answer will probably be none. In other words, we've forgotten all of these people. Even in our history classes, we hardly know premiers. And yet, nowadays, we know premiers are extremely important as shapers of public life. They're as important in a way, and maybe more important in any given province than the prime minister. And yet, and that was true in 1887. But we talk about the provinces in the 19th century, and indeed through the 19th to the present, as if they are inferior beings, when in fact they shape much of our lives. It's amazing to me that we don't teach more provincial history in each province. We should know the conflicts that have shaped the community around us. Bill is a Saskatchewan historian, I'm a Manitoba historian. And I only, I taught it third year and fourth year, the classes that we do. We didn't teach this sort of thing in first or second year. And I don't think we ever had any Saskatchewan story in our high schools. Wavell, can you remember anything? I'm pretty sure
I
we
do
did not.
remember the prejudice of teachers against Riel.
Right.
It was just black and white.
So anyway, that's half a story. And the rest of it, there is a kind of conspiracy. The Tories really did not want Norquay's name aired ever again. And so it became an honored name in Manitoba, really through the 1930s. But by then, how we just forget anything 50 years and more, and then he disappeared. But as I'm saying now, this is an important man. We should know this in Canada.
So as I said to you earlier, I represent the Norquay family here through my wife, who's a descendant of Honourable John. And I should just say, as a point of interest, her father, Ian, still alive, 91, a staunch Tory, thinks Riel's a traitor to this day. So that does carry on through the family line. And yet there are at least four important landmarks that I can just think of that are named after John Norquay. The Norquay Channel in Brunfield, Manitoba, where I grew up. Mount Norquay, Saskatchewan, the Norquay building in Winnipeg. And yet, I don't know if many Manitoba premiers have had so much named after them across a large geographic expanse. So but my real question is this, was this debate ever settled about who the first Indigenous premier of Manitoba is after Walt Kinew was elected? And you just said, he was Indigenous, he wasn't Métis. He was more Indigenous than Riel. Who is the first Indigenous premier of Manitoba?
Well, I've talked to Wab about it, and there's no question Wab thinks he's the second. So a quick answer, Wab does recognize Norquay, but he's added a third. He has made Louis Riel, who of course governed Manitoba before it was Manitoba, as Red River in 1869-70, an honorary premier. So Manitoba now has, if you accept that, three Indigenous premiers, Louis Riel, John Norquay, and Wab Kinew. Mount Norquay is probably the most famous in Western Canada naming. There's a Norquay school in Winnipeg. There's a Norquay school in Vancouver. But people don't know who that Norquay is. And so, back to Bob's question, simply we lose things. And of course, in a world with the Middle East, with Russia, Ukraine, with the China Sea, there are really big questions going on. And it's hard for Canadians to learn about their own story. And it's hard for any one of us in a little place like Saskatchewan or Manitoba to ever hear about our own history and our own story, our own society around us. It's hard to get that through. And, that's how Norquay disappeared, even though the name is there.
I'm probably showing my ignorance, but could you just say a little more about the relationship between Louis Riel and Norquay in terms of the timeline and the changes that occurred in the governance of Manitoba?
Yeah. So Louis Riel came back in 1868. By 1869, in other words, within 12 months, he was leading a provisional government. And that lived for 9 months or so. And in the summer of 1870, troops arrived from Canada, and Riel left his breakfast dishes on the table in Upper Fort Garry, got on a ferry and headed back across the river, Red River, to St. Boniface, because he knew that these troops were not going to treat him well. He then went to the States. As I said, he lived essentially in exile because he was afraid of being murdered by Orange Lodge people. There was a Ontario government had put a price on Riel's head, actually, in that period. And yet Riel was elected 3 times to the House of Commons from St. Boniface, but he never was able to actually sit in the Commons. He signed the book 1 year, but that's all. So Riel from 1875, officially in exile for 5 years. That was the penalty settled upon, then moved to Montana. He came back in 1884, wrote an interesting letter in 1884 saying, I don't know Norquay, but I am very impressed with what he's doing. And I hope he would work with me to aid the people of Prince Albert and District. Now, they never met, as far as I know, and there's no proof of that. Norquay would have regarded him simply as another public figure at a distance during his political career down to 1884. But when Riel came back, Norquay warned his relatives here in Saskatchewan, stay away, I don't trust him. And then, of course, war broke out and Norquay opposed him absolutely. He called the shooting, he called it insane. It was a very bad choice on Riel's part. Now, that takes us into story. Bill's book on 1885 covers this much better than anything I could do. So
I'm going to ask if anybody else has another question. We got time for one more. Okay, you get the mic.
My question is about Norquay's family. I understand he had a brother in Parliament too, and had my great grandmother, I think, was his sister, and they lived at Red Deer Hill.
And their name was Adams.
That's right.
Yes.
So there's another story. Could we hear something about his brother and his people in Congress?
I could talk about that for quite a while, but I bet you could talk longer. But let's start here.
Okay, I'll leave this with you.
Okay, her name was Annie. She was Norquay's half sister. She was born. Norquay's mom died when he was 2, and he remarried. And Annie was born a couple of years later. And then the father, Norquay's father died when he was 8. And Annie couldn't really look after all these kids. And so some were farmed out to a granny down the Red River named Truthwaite, and some more were farmed out to Granny Spence. And Annie and Norquay were with Granny Spence. And that's when he won the scholarship and went into the college. Annie married Charles Adams. There are some fantastic letters in the Norquay collection that I've just been describing from Charles Adams about the family, and you would love to read them, I'm sure. From the paw was where they were at the time. And the children, by the way, in the paw, at age 2 and 3 were speaking Cree, but they hadn't yet learned English. And so that tells you something about the nature of that family. Charles Adams was a fine, witty correspondent, and his letters are great. And he moved to Red Deer Hill in 1882. He settled right next door to Andrew Spence, and you'll know Andrew Spence, who became the president of the Settlers Union supporting Riel a couple of years later. His children wrote Norquay some delightful letters in 1885. we're near the front. We don't know if we're going to survive, but if we do, and God helps us, and so on. They're fantastic letters. So anyway, most of the Adams moved on to Alberta. But of course, I think Granny Adams, one story I've read said she had 142 descendants while she was still alive. So they had huge families. You know, the Adams family was big, and all the kids' families were big. And obviously, you are one of the descendants. Where do you live?
That's the term.
And I hear there's a fantastic Adams family history,
Yes, the book. is-
a big, thick book
I have.
enumerating all those names. Yes.
Great. We're bang on, aren't we? We've done this before, Jerry. We're bang on time. So I think what tonight has demonstrated is the importance of historical understanding. If we're going to meet today's challenges, if we're going to have meaningful discussion, if we're going to have meaningful debate, we need to have historical knowledge. What happened in the past and why? We need to use that knowledge and apply it to today's challenge. And Jerry's demonstrated that tonight. So I want to thank Jerry for launching Norquay here in Saskatoon. I want to thank McNally Robinson for hosting. I want to thank you for coming out. Now the pressure is on you. Buy a book. Thank you very much.